Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you find these quiet wanderings through the past to be a soothing companion for your evenings, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more gentle stories. And while we're here together, do let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always lovely to know who's out there, drifting off with me each night. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we begin a softly lit path through the life of one of the most quietly significant figures of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. So often encased in the mythos of genius, with his unruly hair and knowing eyes etched into the cultural fabric, Einstein is easily imagined as more symbol than man. Yet beneath that image lived a quietly private soul, a thinker more at home in a worn cardigan than a spotlight, someone who found solace not in accolades, but in long solitary walks and the slow unfolding of thought. In this telling, we won't be chasing the dramatic arcs or grand revolutions of physics, though they may appear here and there in the background, like soft wind through a paper curtain. Rather, we'll step carefully through his days, beginning in the shaded quiet of Ulm in southern Germany, where the air was thick with industry and yet little sound came from the cradle in which he lay. We'll follow him through the schoolrooms that stifled him, the boarding houses where he sketched out equations on scraps, and the corridors of the Swiss Patent Office, where under flickering lights he shaped the thoughts that would change the way we see the very fabric of the universe. But all that will come in its time. For now, let's simply rest in the gentle unfolding of a life, its stillnesses, its subtle rhythms, the little habits and modest moments that made up the quiet miracle of Albert Einstein. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, we'll let history whisper rather than shout, guiding you not to awe, but to rest. Albert Einstein was born on the 14th day of March in the year 1879 in the modest southern German city of Ulm, nestled along the banks of the river Danube. It was a place of medieval spires and quiet cobbled streets where tradesmen went about their work beneath gently sloping rooftops, and the air often carried the distant chime of church bells. The city had long been known for its calm industriousness, its woodworkers and weavers, and its slow, patient pace. Into this gentle rhythm came the first cries of the infant Albert, though even those were said to be delayed. For a brief moment, the child made no sound at all. He was born to Hermann and Pauline Einstein, a middle-class Jewish couple with deep familial roots. Hermann, a quiet and hopeful man, ran a small electrical engineering company, while Pauline, musical and meticulous, was descended from a line of cultured tradespeople and had trained as a pianist. She was known to hum softly while tending the household, and it was she who would later instill in young Albert a love of music, particularly the violin, which became a source of lifelong comfort to him. From the start, the boy was unremarkable in appearance, broad-headed, with deep-set eyes, and a rather large cranium that concerned his mother at first. There were whispers even that he might be slow. He spoke little in his early years, preferring instead to observe the world with a grave and quiet intensity. Words came late, but when they did, they arrived in full sentences, deliberate and clear, as though he had waited until they were ready. The household in Ulm was modest, but warm. They lived in an apartment above Hermann's small workshop. Below, in the gentle hiss and hum of early electrical devices, young Albert would sometimes sit and watch his father and uncle tinker with wires and strange, glowing bulbs. It was a world of quiet invention, of slow, methodical trial and error, and though he was not yet old enough to grasp the workings of it, the atmosphere of patient curiosity surely left its mark. The Einsteins were not particularly devout, but they lived comfortably within the cultural bounds of German Jewish life. There were candles on Friday evenings, the soft rustle of Hebrew prayers, and a sense of being part of something slightly apart, quietly distinct in a world that often overlooked such things. It was not a religious home in the strict sense, but there was a moral sensibility, a quiet dignity that seemed to shape the tone of their days. Albert was not alone for long. In 1881, when he was 2 years old, his sister Maya was born. She would become his closest companion, and their bond was a lasting one. They played together in the shade of trees, whispering little ideas and wondering aloud about the stars and the patterns of leaves. Albert, though introspective, was never quite withdrawn. He preferred small groups, moments of stillness and long spells with books or blocks, building small structures with a seriousness that was almost comic in a child so young. The family did not remain in Ulm for long. Economic pressures and the uncertain fortunes of Hermann's business led them to move to Munich when Albert was just a year old. The move was not abrupt, but carried out with the quiet pragmatism that would characterize so many of their decisions. Munich, larger and more bustling than Ulm, offered broader horizons, and it was there that the boy's earliest memories began to take clearer shape. Even so, the Ulm years, though few, seemed to linger in the family's recollections. Pauline, ever nostalgic, would sometimes speak of the way the spring light fell across the windowsill there, or how the air smelled just before the rain. Albert, in later life, rarely mentioned the city, but perhaps in the silence of those earliest days, among the distant hum of his father's machinery and the low murmur of his mother's lullabies, something foundational had already begun to form. As he grew, Albert was slow to conform to expectations. He was not a troublesome child, but nor was he easily moulded. He disliked loud noises and abrupt changes, preferring routine and solitude. School, when it came, would pose its own challenges, but in these earliest years, the world was a more manageable thing, something to observe from a slight remove, to puzzle over at a distance, like the strange pull of a compass needle, which he once received from his father and studied with such reverence that it left a lasting impression. He could not yet name magnetism, but he felt its quiet mystery, and something within him stirred. So begins the story of Albert Einstein, not with fireworks or prodigious displays, but with quietude. With a child who stared a little longer than most, who spoke a little later, and who took the world not at its word, but through his own deliberate eyes. A boy in a quiet city, under a quiet sky, just beginning to wonder. In the quiet of Munich, where wide boulevards stretched between leafy neighborhoods and the air often carried the scent of coal smoke and lilacs, Albert Einstein began his schooling. The family had settled into a comfortable flat in a district known for its middle-class respectability. It was here, amid the quiet hum of domestic routine and the faint ticking of the family's carefully wound clocks, that Albert entered his first classroom. The school he attended was a Catholic primary, a place of stern order and traditional instruction. Albert, a Jewish child in a largely Christian setting, was not made to feel unwelcome, yet from the beginning he seemed slightly apart. The methods of instruction were rigid, built upon rote memorization and unquestioning repetition. Children sat in rows of stiff desks, their hands folded and their eyes fixed upon the chalkboard. Questions, when allowed, were expected to have one answer only. There was little room for wandering thoughts, or for the quiet speculations that often filled Albert's mind. He did not excel, nor did he fail. He simply drifted, attentive enough, but unconvinced by the process. His teachers found him respectful but distant. He did not misbehave, but nor did he engage with the enthusiasm they desired. In his notebooks, he doodled little diagrams and occasionally wrote down questions that had no place in the day's lesson. Why does light move the way it does? Why does a compass point north? These were not the queries of his curriculum. At home, however, Albert found greater ease. His mother ensured that music remained a part of his daily life. She encouraged him to practice the violin, not out of ambition, but as a way to calm the mind and discipline the senses. Though he was not particularly eager at first, over time the instrument became something of a refuge. He played not with brilliance, but with a certain reflective depth, often closing his eyes and letting the notes carry him into a softer world. His father and uncle, meanwhile, introduced him to basic arithmetic and later to more advanced mathematical concepts. His uncle Jacob, in particular, delighted in posing quiet little puzzles to Albert, curious problems involving trains and numbers and time. These were the kinds of questions that engaged the boy more deeply than any school lesson had managed. He would ponder them silently for hours, sometimes waking in the middle of the night to scribble a half-formed solution. The home was filled with books. Not a vast library, but enough to spark curiosity. Scientific pamphlets, electrical manuals, a few well-thumbed volumes of philosophy and literature. Albert took to reading on his own terms, often returning to the same passage repeatedly, not for lack of comprehension, but because he found something restful in the rhythm of certain ideas. He developed a fondness for the works of Kant, and would later recall how the philosopher's dense prose gave him a kind of mental anchoring, a structure in which to nest his own questions. Despite the gentle support at home, school remained a trial. As he progressed to the Luitpold Gymnasium, a more formal and demanding secondary school, the sense of mismatch grew sharper. The school, while respected, upheld a system of education that left little room for divergence. Teachers expected deference and obedience, qualities Albert did not possess in abundance. He questioned the premises of lessons, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a directness that unsettled his instructors. It was not defiance, but a kind of honest bewilderment. He did not understand why one must accept things without proof. He found the Latin exercises dry, the Greek translations laborious, and the regimented drills of moral instruction both redundant and oddly disjointed from real life. He began to retreat into himself during lessons, losing focus and instead occupying his mind with private speculations. Why did space seem so empty, yet full of laws? Why did time feel different depending on one's mood or surroundings? He did not make many friends, though he was not unfriendly. His manner was quiet, sometimes aloof. He could be intensely focused one moment, then wholly distracted the next. He was not a joiner of games, nor a participant in loud gatherings. But he formed a few gentle connections, fellow students who shared his love of reading or his distrust of authority. These friendships, though not especially close, provided a faint counterpoint to the isolation he often felt. There were, of course, small joys. The comfort of a warm pastry on the way home from school, the curious gleam of gaslights in the winter fog, the quiet thrill of understanding a complex problem after long reflection, and, always, music. In the evenings, after his homework was done or set aside, he would take up his violin and play softly to himself, losing all sense of the hours. As he neared adolescence, Albert's discomfort with formal schooling deepened. His teachers began to view him not as merely indifferent, but problematic. One famously remarked that he would never amount to anything, a sentiment often repeated in later years with a kind of ironic triumph. But at the time, it was simply a reflection of the growing gap between his inner life and the demands of institutional learning. In 1894, when Albert was 15, the family's financial troubles once again prompted a move. This time, it was to Milan, in northern Italy. Hermann's business had faltered in Germany, and he hoped for better prospects in the Italian market. Albert was left behind at first to complete his studies at the gymnasium, but he grew increasingly despondent, and after a period of mounting unhappiness, he quietly left the school and joined his family in Milan. It was not a rebellion exactly, but a quiet refusal. He no longer wished to remain in a system that made no room for his way of thinking. In Milan, freed from the rigidity of formal education, he began to study on his own. He read widely mathematics, physics, philosophy, and began to shape his own curriculum. It was in these months of unstructured thought, in the quiet rooms of a borrowed apartment, that Albert began to recover something of his inner balance. The world had not yet recognized his potential. To most, he was simply a wayward student, clever perhaps, but undisciplined. Yet within him, something was beginning to crystallize. Not a theory, not yet, but a disposition, a way of looking at things not for what they appeared to be, but for what they quietly suggested. He was learning, slowly and gently, to trust his own mind. By the time Albert Einstein arrived in Zurich to begin his studies at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, the year was 1896, and he was 17 years old. The city, straddling the northern edge of a glistening lake and framed by the slow roll of distant Alps, was a place of measured movement and intellectual ease. Here, cobbled streets gave way to well-worn lecture halls, and the cafes were filled not with noise, but with the quiet scratch of pen on paper and the low murmur of academic debate. Albert had not taken the most conventional path to get there. Having failed to complete his formal schooling in Germany, he had prepared independently for the Polytechnic entrance exam. He passed the science and mathematics portions with ease, though his results in the humanities were less than stellar. Even so, the professors recognized a certain spark, a depth of understanding that ran quietly beneath his youthful disregard for academic protocol. He was admitted to the school, and with it came a modest but significant sense of direction. The Polytechnic, later known as ETH Zurich, was not grand in appearance. Its buildings were sturdy rather than majestic, with thick walls and narrow staircases that creaked underfoot. The atmosphere was neither indulgent nor oppressive. It allowed, in its own reserved Swiss manner, for a degree of intellectual breathing room. Albert found this liberating. Though he still struggled with the formalities of academic life, he was now among a cadre of students and lecturers who, at the very least, understood the shape of his questions. He enrolled in the teaching diploma program in physics and mathematics, and it was here that he encountered a number of figures who would influence him in subtle but lasting ways. Among them was Hermann Minkowski, who would later help formalize Einstein's theories in the language of space-time. At the time, however, the two did not form a close bond. Minkowski found Einstein inattentive and dismissive, while Albert found most lectures too slow, too bound by convention. Indeed, Einstein's approach to learning remained characteristically independent. He often skipped classes, preferring to study from textbooks in the quiet of his room or in the university library, where the smell of aged paper and polished wood seemed to foster concentration. He had developed a fondness for the works of Maxwell, Boltzmann, and Helmholtz, and would read their treatises practices not for exams, but for the pleasure of following a line of reasoning to its distant, elegant conclusion. It was during this period that Albert began to refine the art of the thought experiment, a quiet, methodical form of inner visualization. He would imagine scenarios not with elaborate models or physical demonstrations, but in the mind's eye. A beam of light chased through the ether, a clock seen from a moving train, a mirror held aloft in empty space. These were not idle dreams, but structured exercises in logic and possibility, conducted in silence and often revisited over days, weeks, even years. Despite his brilliance in certain areas, Einstein was not a model student. His relationship with professors remained strained, and he earned a reputation for being stubborn, sometimes even aloof. He resisted authority, not out of rebellion, but from a quiet conviction that true understanding could not be dictated. This stance, though admirable in its way, had practical consequences. When the time came to seek academic recommendations, few were forthcoming. His professors, unimpressed by his indifference to classroom decorum, were reluctant to endorse him. And so, upon graduation in 1900, Albert found himself without a clear path. His grades were respectable, but not exceptional. His demeanor had not endeared him to the academic establishment. Jobs were scarce, particularly for those who failed to fit the expected mold. For a time, he drifted. He took on odd tutoring positions, most of them short-lived, often with students who found his methods confusing or unorthodox. He spent long hours in the cafes of Zurich, reading quietly and scribbling in notebooks, more occupied with abstract problems than with the demands of earning a living. Throughout this period, his financial situation remained precarious. His parents, now living in Milan, could offer little support. His rooms were spare and often cold. Meals were simple: bread, cheese, the occasional apple, and he relied on a handful of friends for both companionship and the occasional loan. One such friend, Marcel Grossmann, had been a fellow student and would later play an important role in helping Einstein secure employment. For now, though, it was a time of uncertainty. Yet even in this uncertainty, Einstein's mind remained active. He continued to read voraciously, to write letters filled with speculative ideas, and to engage in long, meandering conversations about philosophy and science with the few companions who shared his wavelength. There was no sense of crisis in him, only a quiet persistence, a belief that something would take shape in time. It was also during these years that Einstein's personal life began to grow more complex. He had formed a relationship with a fellow student, Mileva Maric, a Serbian woman of strong intellect and reserved manner. Their bond developed slowly through shared study and long discussions. Though not universally approved, Mileva's background and gender both invited scrutiny. The connection deepened, and by the end of their time at the Polytechnic, they were effectively partners in both life and thought. They corresponded frequently, their letters filled with equations and endearments in equal measure. Albert admired Mileva's intelligence, and she, in turn, encouraged his work with quiet steadiness. Their relationship, while not without its tensions, was grounded in mutual respect, at least in these early years. They would eventually marry, but for now their partnership existed within the tentative space between academia and adulthood, where dreams were many and outcomes uncertain. As the century turned and the old world slipped gently into a new one, Albert Einstein stood on the threshold, not yet the icon, not yet the revolutionary, but a young man of quiet habits and deep thoughts. He wore well-worn clothes, carried a violin in a battered case, and walked with a slightly distracted air, as if always in pursuit of some half-formed idea. The city of Zurich, with its calm streets and clear skies, offered a fitting backdrop. It did not demand brilliance, but neither did it hinder it. It allowed, simply, for the slow unfolding of thought. By the early months of the new century, Albert Einstein was 21 years old, his trousers slightly frayed at the hems, his pockets often empty, and his future still unresolved. Though his diploma from the Polytechnic lay neatly folded, there was no academic post awaiting him, no firm invitation from the scientific world to step forward. Instead, he occupied a kind of limbo, a twilight space between studenthood and profession, where the days were filled with study and uncertainty in equal measure. And through it all, Mileva Maric remained by his side, at least in correspondence, if not always in person. Their relationship had deepened steadily during their shared years at the Polytechnic, though it had not been without its complications. Mileva, a few years older than Albert and deeply serious in temperament, had faced her own barriers, not only as a woman in science, but as a foreigner, one who bore the quiet weight of expectations and family concerns, far from Zurich. Their bond, forged in the margins of textbooks and in shared reverence for the great physicists, was both intellectual and emotional. Albert's letters to her from this period are filled with tenderness, sometimes clumsily expressed, but always earnest. He addressed her playfully as Dolly, and often veered between abstract scientific discussions and affectionate musings. He confided in her his frustrations, his ambitions, and his dream of a quiet life spent together, working side by side, perhaps in some small teaching post, with time enough for thought and music and long walks in the woods. Mileva, for her part, responded in kind, though with a touch more caution. Her letters reveal both warmth and a sense of resignation. She was bright, well-read, and deeply committed to the field of physics, yet she had begun to sense the limitations that would shadow her path. Her grades at the Polytechnic had faltered in the final examinations, and whether from illness, distraction, or structural bias, she had failed to earn her diploma. This loss placed her on uncertain footing, professionally and personally, and yet her faith in Albert remained steady. In 1901, their connection took on new gravity. That summer, while visiting Mileva in Hungary, Albert fathered a child, a daughter named Liesl. The pregnancy was kept secret from most of their acquaintances, and the child, born in early 1902, likely in Novi Sad or a nearby village, was never publicly acknowledged by Einstein. The details surrounding Liesl's fate remain obscure, but the most accepted account suggests that she was given up for adoption or perhaps died in infancy. No photographs or documents survive, and Albert never mentioned her in later life. The secrecy, the uncertainty, the sorrow of those months hung quietly in the background. It was a difficult time for them both. Albert had yet to find stable employment. His relationship with his family, particularly with his mother Pauline, had become strained. She disapproved of Mileva, considering her both too serious and too foreign, and Mileva herself, grieving and perhaps already sensing the path ahead narrowing, carried more than her share of quiet burdens. Relief, when it came, was modest. In mid-1902, through the help of his old friend Marcel Grossmann and his father's connections, Albert secured a position as a technical assistant at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. It was not an academic job, nor one that promised prestige. He would be tasked with evaluating technical designs, many of them mundane, such as types of machinery, electrical circuits, or timekeeping devices. But the salary was sufficient, the hours regular and the atmosphere unassuming. Albert embraced it with quiet gratitude. He worked diligently, reviewing applications with a kind of detached precision. The nature of the work, requiring attention to detail but not emotional investment, left his mind free for more speculative pursuits. In the evenings and weekends he read, wrote and reflected, developing ideas that had taken root years earlier during his solitary study sessions in Zurich. In early 1903, Albert and Mileva married. The ceremony was simple, lacking in fanfare. They were now husband and wife, living in a modest flat in Bern. Their home was sparsely furnished, with a few bookshelves, a small dining table, and a violin that Albert kept close by. Their life together was quiet, sometimes strained by finances and the demands of daily work, but underpinned by shared history and a lingering belief in the importance of thought, of ideas. That same year, Albert's father Hermann died. The relationship between them had never been especially close, but it was not without affection. Hermann had lived long enough to see his son married and employed, but not long enough to witness the unfolding of the quiet revolution that was beginning in his son's mind. Albert received the news with a kind of solemn stillness. He was not given to outward displays of grief, but he did not speak much during those days. Life in Bern settled into a gentle routine. Albert would leave in the morning for the patent office, his briefcase under one arm, his hat set slightly askew. He worked 6 days a week, usually from 8 to 6. During breaks, he would sometimes sketch out equations on scrap paper or step outside for a slow walk around the block. In the evenings, he and Mileva would dine simply, potatoes, soup, the occasional bottle of wine. And afterward, Albert would often return to his notes, while Mileva read or embroidered quietly nearby. Their first son, Hans Albert, was born in 1904. Albert, now a father once more, held the infant with a kind of cautious reverence. He was not a man given to exuberant affection, but there was a gentleness in the way he cradled the boy, a soft murmur in his voice when he spoke to him in the half-light. Parenthood, though it brought new strains, also seemed to ground him more firmly in the domestic world. And through all of this, the letters, the losses, the long days at the patent office, Albert's mind continued to turn. Quietly, without fanfare, he was developing the foundations of what would later be called the annus mirabilis, the miracle year. But that too would come in time. For now, he was simply a husband, a father, a clerk, living in a small apartment in a quiet corner of Bern, taking slow evening walks by the river, thinking always, gently, of light and time and the curious ways of the world. The years Albert Einstein spent at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern from 1902 to 1909 unfolded with a quiet constancy that suited his temperament. The building itself, unassuming in both style and stature, was tucked away on a side street not far from the city's old town. Inside, the rooms were filled with the soft scratch of fountain pens, the rustle of paper, and the ticking of clocks, both literal and metaphorical. It was, by all appearances, a place of modest routine, where technical documents were examined not with curiosity, but with regulatory care. Einstein held the title of technical expert, third class. It was a humble designation, but one that came with surprising freedom. He reviewed patent applications for electromagnetic devices, telegraphic systems, clocks, and assorted mechanisms of the industrial world. The work required a firm grasp of technical language and logical reasoning, yet left the imagination untouched. It neither asked nor prevented invention. It simply required understanding. And so, in the quiet intervals between one patent and the next, Einstein's mind wandered. His office was small, with a window that overlooked a narrow street. The desk, plain and slightly worn, bore the marks of regular use. On it were scattered papers, not only the official forms of patent claims, but loose sheets on which he scribbled equations and diagrams. A battered inkpot stood near the edge, beside a collection of pencils, some worn to the stub. He worked methodically, without hurry, and often with a faraway look in his eyes, as if the thing he was considering lay, not on the paper before him, but somewhere just beyond the reach of sight. It was here that Einstein began to explore, in earnest, the puzzles that had long occupied his thoughts. Chief among them was the nature of light. Ever since boyhood, he had wondered what it would mean to ride alongside a beam of light, to match its velocity, to see its form suspended in motion. The question had become more precise with time, but no less strange. If light moved at a constant speed, independent of the observer's motion, then how could time and space remain as fixed and absolute as they were said to be? These were not problems addressed in his daily work, yet they filled the margins of his day. He pondered them during lunch breaks, while walking to and from the office, and in the long evenings at home. The apartment he shared with Mileva and their son was quiet, the furniture sparse. Often, after supper, he would retire to his desk or pace the room slowly, gesturing lightly with his hands as he turned a problem over in his mind. His method of thinking was visual and conceptual. He did not rush to formulae or symbols, but first constructed mental scenarios, what he called Gedankenexperimente, or thought experiments. He imagined trains moving at high speeds, observers with lanterns, clocks ticking in synchrony, and mirrors reflecting light under peculiar conditions. These scenes played out not on a blackboard, but in the mind's eye, governed by intuition and logic rather than apparatus. Outside of work and thought, his circle remained small. He was not a social man, though not unfriendly. In Bern, he gathered occasionally with a few friends in what they called the Olympia Academy, a kind of informal discussion group whose members included Maurice Solovin and Konrad Habicht. They met in each other's flats, drank cheap wine, and read texts aloud. Poincaré, Mach, Spinoza. The discussions wandered, sometimes serious, sometimes absurd. It was a space free from pretense, and Einstein valued it deeply. Though his relationship with Mileva remained steady on the surface, strains had begun to appear. She had once shared his scientific pursuits closely, but with motherhood and the constraints of domestic life, that shared space had begun to narrow. Einstein, absorbed in his ideas and increasingly recognized for his talent by a small but growing number of peers, drifted further into the solitary patterns of his inner world. The flat, while peaceful, was not always warm with intimacy. Then, in 1905, came a series of moments that would quietly shift the course of physics forever. That spring and summer, Einstein, still employed full-time at the patent office, submitted 4 papers to the Annalen der Physik, one of the leading German scientific journals. Each of these papers, composed during stolen hours and scribbled late at night in the soft glow of lamplight, addressed a different problem. But taken together, they marked what would later be called his miracle year. The first paper explored the photoelectric effect, suggesting that light, long thought to behave as a wave, might also act as discrete particles, what would later be called photons. The second examined Brownian motion, offering statistical evidence for the existence of atoms. The third proposed the special theory of relativity, upending the long-held belief in absolute time and space. And the fourth, a brief note, introduced the now famous equation, E equals mc squared. At the time, these publications caused no great stir, They were read, noted, and occasionally discussed among physicists, but Einstein remained a clerk. His name was not yet widely known, yet slowly word began to spread. In academic circles, particularly in Germany and Switzerland, a few scholars took notice of the clarity and originality of these ideas. Correspondence began to trickle in, letters of cautious interest, questions posed respectfully. The tone was subdued, but the tide was turning. Einstein himself remained modest. He continued his duties at the patent office, never expecting that his papers would lead to anything beyond intellectual satisfaction. He was not a man given to pride, and he spoke little of his work outside of his closest friends. To others, he was still the quiet man with the tousled hair and the unfocused gaze, who arrived promptly and left without fanfare. Yet in the quiet of those Bernese evenings, the world had shifted. The foundations of modern physics had begun to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The man who walked each day past the clock tower of Zeitgloge, his shoes worn and his coat slightly rumpled, had redefined the concepts of time and space, not with proclamations, but with quiet persistence, ink-stained pages, and long, thoughtful walks along the Aar River. In the annals of scientific history, the year 1905 stands with a quiet dignity, its significance hidden not in grand announcements or public spectacles, but in a handful of typeset pages, composed by a young man who spent his days examining patent applications in a small Swiss office. For Albert Einstein, that year was neither triumphant nor ceremonious. It passed, for the most part, like any other. The modest rhythms of daily life continued unbroken. He rose each morning, dressed simply, and walked the cobbled streets of Bern to the patent office, where he sat at his desk and worked through the hours with quiet diligence. Yet in the spaces between those hours, in the soft murmur of evening, in the hush of early morning, in the pages he turned by candlelight, a revolution was unfolding. Not a noisy one, nor violent, nor even consciously ambitious, but it was a revolution nonetheless, and it began in silence. The first of his 4 remarkable papers appeared in March of that year, in the Annalen der Physik. It addressed a phenomenon that had puzzled physicists for some time, the photoelectric effect. When light strikes certain metals, electrons are emitted, a curious behavior that classical wave theory could not quite account for. Einstein proposed something quietly radical. What if light behaved not solely as a wave, but as a stream of discrete packets, or quanta? He drew upon the work of Max Planck, who had introduced the quantum concept a few years earlier, and extended it further, suggesting that light itself might be quantized. This was a bold departure from the accepted view, but it was framed not with bluster, but with clarity and care. Then, in May, he submitted a paper on Brownian motion, the erratic movement of particles suspended in fluid, first observed by the botanist Robert Brown in the 1820s. Einstein offered a mathematical framework that explained the phenomenon as the result of countless collisions with invisible atoms and molecules. In doing so, he provided empirical support for the atomic theory of matter, a theory that, even then, was not universally accepted. His work gave substance to the intangible, grounding speculation in careful reasoning. The third paper, published in June, was perhaps the most quietly disruptive of all. Titled On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, it introduced what would become known as the special theory of relativity. Its premises were disarmingly simple, that the laws of physics are the same for all observers in uniform motion, and that the speed of light is constant, regardless of the motion of the source or observer. From these 2 postulates flowed a series of consequences that challenged the very fabric of classical physics. Time, it seemed, was not absolute. Simultaneity was relative. The order of events could shift depending on the motion of the observer. It was a paper without references or footnotes, composed in plain language and with striking brevity. Einstein did not shout his conclusions. He laid them out gently, like stepping stones across a stream. There was no demand for recognition, no claim to fame, only the quiet insistence of logic unfolding step by step. And then, in September, came a brief follow-up, a note just a few pages long, titled, "Does the inertia of a body depend upon its energy content?" In it, he derived the now iconic equation E equals mc squared. It stated, in essence, that mass and energy were interchangeable, that a small amount of mass could be converted into a vast quantity of energy. The implications of this insight would not be fully grasped for decades, but the seed had been sown. In his personal life, little changed. He continued his work at the patent office, continued to share meals with Mileva and to cradle young Hans Albert in the evenings. There was no rush of celebration, no sudden change in circumstance. His papers were noticed, but the full significance of them was not yet clear to most readers. He received a few letters of interest, some polite inquiries, a few cautious compliments, but there was no great acclaim. It was as if the world had blinked and missed a miracle, and perhaps that was as it should be. Einstein himself had no appetite for glory. He distrusted authority and disliked publicity. He preferred modest rooms, quiet evenings, and the company of a few close friends. To him, the work of understanding the universe was not a performance, but a private calling, a kind of listening, a patient waiting for truth to emerge from the silence. In those months, he walked often through the streets of Bern, sometimes stopping by the clock tower to observe its workings, other times pausing by the river to watch the light dance on the surface. He thought constantly about light, about motion, about time and space. Yet his thoughts were not restless. They were steady, contemplative, as if he were turning a stone over in his hands, feeling its shape, its texture, its quiet resistance. Mileva, too, bore witness to this period. She typed his manuscripts, offered comments, cared for their son, and managed the small household. Their marriage, though functional, was beginning to show signs of strain. Albert's mind, always distant, had become more so. He was deeply immersed in his ideas, and while he remained kind and attentive in small ways, the warmth between them had begun to cool. They lived in parallel now, their lives gently touching, but seldom entwined. And so the miracle year passed. There were no celebrations, no ceremonies, just the slow rhythm of days, the murmur of paper, the soft scratching of a pen. But the world had shifted. Quietly, irrevocably, it had shifted. The old certainties had been set aside, not with violence, but with thought, and the man who had done it, with his uncombed hair and quiet manner, returned each evening to his small apartment, where his child slept and the light dimmed slowly against the Swiss sky. By 1909, Albert Einstein had begun to feel the first gentle ripple of recognition, like a breeze catching the edge of a long-stilled curtain. Though he still held his post at the Swiss Patent Office, his 1905 papers had gradually filtered through the quiet channels of academic physics, and those few who had taken the time to study them closely were beginning to murmur his name. Letters came more frequently now, not just from curious students or occasional admirers, but from established physicists who saw in his work something deeply original, something unsettling and necessary. That year, at the age of 30, Einstein was offered his first formal academic position, a lectureship at the University of Zurich. It was a modest post, but it marked the first time he would be paid to think. The transition from the patent office to the university was not abrupt, but it was meaningful. He left behind the regulated hours and bureaucratic precision of civil service for the quieter corridors of academia, where he could speak openly of light and time and energy, and where the ideas he had once nurtured in solitude could now be shared aloud. In Zurich, he lectured on theoretical physics. His teaching style was informal, sometimes even hesitant. He preferred discussion to dictation and often wandered into tangents that were not strictly part of the syllabus. Some students found him difficult to follow, while others were captivated by the originality of his thought. He had little patience for academic formalities, rarely wore a tie, and spoke softly, often with a slight smile or furrowed brow. He was not a natural lecturer in the traditional sense, but he possessed a calm intensity that drew the attentive listener in. During this time, he continued to publish. His ideas on relativity deepened, and he began to explore questions that extended beyond the framework of his 1905 paper. He considered accelerated motion, gravitational fields, and the possibility of a more general theory that would encompass a wider range of physical phenomena. The groundwork for general relativity was slowly forming, though it would take years of refinement and reimagining. His personal life, however, was becoming more complicated. Mileva and Albert now had two sons, Hans Albert and Eduard. Their apartment was filled with the small noises of domestic life, children's laughter, the creak of chairs, the soft clatter of evening meals. But the warmth that had once underpinned their relationship had faded. Einstein, absorbed in his work, had become distant. Mileva, once his collaborator and confidant, now found herself isolated, her own ambitions stifled by the demands of home and the shifting balance of affection. They argued more often, not violently, nor with cruelty, but with the weary tone of two people moving quietly apart. Mileva struggled with depression, and Albert, while not unkind, was often absent in thought. He sought solace in correspondence with friends, in long solitary walks, and increasingly in travel. Invitations to speak at conferences began to arrive. Though he was still not widely famous, his reputation within physics was growing. In 1911, he accepted a professorship in Prague at the German university. It was a significant appointment, and he approached it with his usual quiet seriousness. Prague itself was a city of soft fog and old stones, its streets winding and narrow. Einstein enjoyed its pace, its bookshops, its modest cafes. He taught, thought, and wrote, continuing his efforts to extend relativity into new realms. It was in Prague that he began to explore the influence of gravity on light and time, early sketches of what would become general relativity. He considered how light might bend as it passed near a massive object, and how time might pass differently in the presence of gravity. These thoughts, at first only inklings, began to take shape on the pages of his notebooks, in small, careful script. After a year, he returned to Zurich, this time to a more senior position. The move suited him. He was closer to familiar friends, and Zurich offered a blend of intellectual quietude and modest comfort. But even as his academic standing grew, his home life continued to suffer. The distance between him and Mileva had become more pronounced, and the strain was palpable. In 1913, another invitation came, this one from Berlin, from the Prussian Academy of Sciences. The offer was prestigious, and it came with the promise of fewer teaching obligations and more time for research. It was also personally complicated, as it would place him near Elsa Löwenthal, a cousin with whom he had begun a tentative and emotionally tangled friendship. Albert accepted. He moved to Berlin in 1914, alone. The plan had been for Mileva and the children to join him later, but the move never took place. The marriage, stretched too thin across too many cities and silences, quietly fractured. Mileva returned to Zurich with the boys. The formal separation followed, and eventually, divorce. In Berlin, Einstein entered a new phase. He lived simply in a sparsely furnished flat. His daily routine was uneventful. He rose early, worked through the morning, walked in the afternoon, and often played violin in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. He remained resistant to the growing attention he received. Though his name was becoming more widely known, he recoiled from fame. He did not consider himself a public figure. He was, he insisted, a man of thought, nothing more. His work during these years moved steadily toward general relativity. He wrestled with the mathematics, often in solitude, scribbling and crossing out equations with quiet determination. He corresponded with mathematicians, sought guidance where needed, and gradually built the theoretical scaffolding that would support his most ambitious idea. And through all of it, teaching, traveling, and thinking, Einstein remained at heart the same quiet figure who had once puzzled over a compass as a boy. He approached the universe not as a conqueror, but as a listener, attuned to its faint signals and gentle symmetries. The world around him had begun to take notice, but he still moved through it with unhurried steps, trusting that clarity, like light, would come not with force, but with patience. By the winter of 1915, in a quiet office in Berlin, Albert Einstein stood on the cusp of completing what he would later call the finest work of his life. The general theory of relativity, the culmination of years of deep thought, quiet persistence, and painstaking revision, was finally taking its proper shape. The journey to that point had not been swift. It had unfolded in slow, uncertain stages, much like the curve of a question long held within and only gradually answered. Einstein had been thinking about gravity in new terms. The idea that gravity was a force between masses, as Newton had described, was not wrong, but incomplete. Einstein proposed a different way of seeing it, not as a force at all, but as a curvature of space and time itself. Mass, he reasoned, bent the fabric of the universe, and objects moved not because they were pulled, but because they followed the straightest possible path in this curved geometry. It was a subtle, beautiful idea, elegant in its quiet logic. But the mathematics of it were demanding. Einstein was no pure mathematician. He preferred the clarity of thought experiments and visual reasoning. Yet here he was, wrestling with tensor calculus and differential geometry, guided and supported in part by his friend Marcel Grossmann, who had long since become a professor in Zurich. Their correspondence, gently formal, sometimes urgent, traced the evolution of Einstein's thinking as he inched toward the final field equations. He presented his completed theory in November 1915 in a series of lectures to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. The final version, delivered at month's end, offered a compact yet profound set of equations that described the gravitational interaction not through invisible forces, but through the shape of space-time itself. There was no applause, no thunderous response, just a quiet nod from the assembled scholars, and the slow turning of pages. At first, few beyond the world of theoretical physics took much notice. The paper was dense, its implications difficult to grasp. But Einstein, ever the patient explainer, continued to write, to clarify, to gently bring others along. In the spring of 1916, he published a more accessible version of the theory, aiming to share its essence with a wider scientific audience. It began, as was his way, not with declarations, but with quiet reflection. In what follows, I wish to present the general theory of relativity in a form accessible to the reader unacquainted with the mathematics of the subject. Still, the theory remained largely theoretical. It needed validation, some observable prediction that could be tested. One such prediction was that light would bend as it passed near a massive object, a star, for example. In 1919, during a total solar eclipse, a team led by Sir Arthur Eddington observed starlight curving around the sun's edge, just as Einstein had predicted. The confirmation was not immediate, but it was enough. The newspapers, ever eager for novelty, seized the story. And just like that, Albert Einstein became famous, but it was not the sort of fame he had ever desired. He had no taste for ceremony, no patience for interviews, yet his face, gentle, thoughtful, slightly dishevelled, began to appear in newspapers, journals, even on postcards. People were captivated not only by his theories, which they often did not understand, but by his image, the absent-minded professor, the solitary genius. It was an image he neither cultivated nor rejected. He simply carried on, walking the streets of Berlin in his familiar coat, violin case in hand, trying not to notice the stares. He continued to live modestly. His apartment was small, its furnishings plain. He kept to a quiet routine, rising early, working in the mornings, receiving visitors in the afternoon if needed, and playing music in the evenings. He remained accessible to students, replying to letters with careful consideration. He did not surround himself with admirers or disciples. He preferred honest discussion to flattery. The success of general relativity opened doors. Universities across Europe extended invitations. Scientific societies awarded honors. Yet Einstein remained rooted, reluctant to travel far or often. He valued solitude, long walks, and the quiet company of a few trusted friends. His health, always a little fragile, required rest and reflection. He suffered occasional bouts of digestive trouble and fatigue that followed periods of intense concentration. The post-war years were difficult in Germany. Inflation spiraled, political tensions simmered, and the streets of Berlin often echoed with unrest. Einstein, though not a politician, spoke openly against nationalism and militarism. He supported democratic ideals, championed academic freedom, and spoke on behalf of displaced scholars and victims of anti-Semitism. His fame gave him a platform, and though he used it sparingly, he did not ignore it. He also began to travel more, slowly and with some hesitation. In 1921, he journeyed to the United States, where he was received with great enthusiasm. Crowds gathered, reporters waited, and public lectures sold out. He found the experience exhausting but also curious. The American appetite for novelty puzzled him. He gave his talks, posed for photographs, and accepted honors with quiet grace. But he was always glad to return home. By this time, he had grown close to Elsa, his cousin, who had supported him through the dissolution of his first marriage. They married in 1919, not long after his divorce from Mileva was finalized. Elsa brought with her a sense of calm and care. She managed his affairs, protected his time, and ensured that the practical demands of fame did not wholly overwhelm him. Their home became a kind of refuge, modest, orderly, and filled with music. Einstein's hair, once neatly combed, now stood out more freely. His wardrobe remained simple. He disdained formality, preferred old sweaters to suits, and often misplaced important documents. Yet behind the casual manner was a mind still turning, still questioning, still seeking. He wrote more slowly now, but no less deeply. New questions had arisen about the quantum world, about the possibility of unifying the forces of nature. But these new inquiries were less certain. The clarity he had found in relativity seemed harder to grasp in the emerging world of quantum mechanics. Still, he worked, patiently, quietly, persistently, and always, in the background, the soft murmur of fame continued, uninvited but not unwelcome. For Einstein, the heart of life remained unchanged. It was not in the headlines, not in the crowds. It was in the rhythm of thought, the music of a well-played phrase, the long silent gaze out a window as morning light shifted across the wall. During the 1920s, Berlin remained both the center of Einstein's public life and the quiet backdrop to his more private reflections. The city, with its sprawling boulevards, late-night cafes and flickering gas lamps, was a place of contrasts. Restless energy on the one hand, and in the early hours of the morning, a near-monastic silence. Einstein moved through its streets unobtrusively, a solitary figure in a crumpled coat, often with a letter in one hand and a violin case in the other. By now he was known across the world. His name evoked not only his theories, but a broader sense of quiet, intelligent rebellion against the rigidity of established thinking. Yet Einstein himself remained largely unchanged. He disliked the formalities of public life and rarely accepted invitations unless they came with a genuine opportunity for meaningful discussion. Most days he returned home promptly after work, where Elsa managed the household and guarded his time with discreet precision. Their marriage, built less on passion than on companionship, had found a comfortable rhythm. Elsa was patient and practical. She understood his habits, his occasional moodiness, his need for solitude. She also bore the increasing burden of his public image, managing correspondence, fielding requests, and handling the endless stream of visitors who wished simply to see him, to ask him something, or to bask in the quiet aura of his presence. Einstein's personal life was, by this point, marked by distance, not only from the outside world, but also from his first family. His sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, remained in Zurich with Mileva. He wrote to them regularly, especially to Hans Albert, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional equation. Their relationship was cordial, though never particularly close. With Eduard, the younger son, he struggled more. Sensitive, artistic, and intellectually curious, Eduard shared many traits with his father, yet their connection was tinged with misunderstanding. Einstein often expressed concern for Eduard's well-being. As the boy grew older, signs of psychological difficulty began to emerge. Mood swings, withdrawn behavior, and eventually a diagnosis of schizophrenia. The news reached Einstein in Berlin through letters, and it troubled him deeply. Though he visited when he could, his visits were infrequent, and he often felt helpless, unsure how to bridge the emotional gap between them. His letters became more philosophical in tone, filled with gentle advice on the mind's mysteries, on finding balance, on accepting the unknowable. To Mileva too, he wrote, though rarely with warmth. Their marriage had ended in tension, and their correspondence, though necessary for the children's sake, was formal and occasionally strained. Yet he did not forget her contribution, nor her sacrifices. In later years, when his financial situation improved, he ensured that she received a portion of the money awarded with the Nobel Prize. A gesture made not out of obligation alone, but from a lingering sense of fairness. At the same time, Einstein's fame continued to grow. He received honorary doctorates, medals, and countless invitations to speak abroad. In 1922, he traveled to Asia, visiting Japan, China, and India. The journey was long and often exhausting, but it left a strong impression. In Japan especially, he was touched by the quiet dignity and attentiveness of his hosts. He gave lectures to packed halls where students sat silently, hanging on his every word. He later wrote of the calm, the order, the respect for learning that he sensed there. Yet always he returned to Berlin, to the quiet rooms where Elsa prepared tea and where the afternoon light fell just so across his writing desk. He remained deeply engaged with physics, though the path had grown more uncertain. His efforts to reconcile quantum theory with relativity, to find a unified field theory that would describe all of nature's forces, continued without resolution. He worked alone for the most part, declining to follow the mainstream of physics, which had shifted toward quantum mechanics. He distrusted the probabilistic nature of the quantum world. God does not play dice, he famously remarked, not out of religious sentiment, but from a belief that nature's laws must be orderly, not random. This philosophical stance set him apart from many younger physicists who embraced the new theories with enthusiasm. Einstein, while respectful, held his ground. He wrote papers, engaged in cordial debates, and maintained a firm belief in the value of clear, deterministic reasoning. His letters from this period, collected, carefully folded, often kept in quiet drawers, reveal a man at once deeply engaged with the world's questions and gently withdrawing from its noise. He wrote with kindness, often with humour, occasionally with a tone of weary resignation. To friends, he sent reflections on politics, science, and music. To distant relatives, quiet updates. To colleagues, precisely worded thoughts on curvature, tensors, and coordinate systems. At times, he retreated completely. He spent summers in the countryside, often in Capeth, where he had a small summer house overlooking a lake. There, he could sail his boat, sit for hours in thought, and walk the forest paths with only the rustle of leaves for company. These retreats were not escapes, but necessary pauses, moments of stillness in a life increasingly shaped by others' expectations. Berlin itself was changing. The political atmosphere grew darker, more volatile. Nationalist sentiments were rising, and Einstein, a pacifist, a Jew, and a symbol of internationalism, began to attract the attention of hostile voices. He received threats, was watched by political agitators, and found his name invoked in angry speeches. He responded not with anger, but with quiet persistence. He continued to speak out, for peace, for human rights, for international cooperation, but he also began to sense that his time in Germany might be drawing to a close. Yet in his quiet rooms, with the ticking of a modest clock and the occasional creak of a wooden floorboard, Einstein continued much as before, writing letters, thinking carefully, avoiding drama, and always returning to the patient discipline of thought. In these letters from Berlin, scattered now across archives and attics, there remains the steady pulse of a life lived not for acclaim, but for the simple act of wondering. The early 1930s brought a slow but unmistakable change to Albert Einstein's life, not with abruptness, but with the creeping certainty of a tide that could no longer be held back. The atmosphere in Germany had shifted. What had once been murmurs of discontent now echoed through the streets of Berlin, in newspapers, and on the tongues of passers-by. The rise of the National Socialist Party had transformed the city's rhythm, sharpening its corners and tightening the spaces in which difference could quietly reside. Einstein, though not political in the partisan sense, had never been silent. His opposition to war, his defense of pacifist ideals, his Jewish identity, and his refusal to be molded into a nationalist symbol had made him increasingly vulnerable in the eyes of the new regime. His name appeared on lists, his lectures were protested, and on more than one occasion the authorities made it clear that he was no longer welcome. In early 1933, while visiting the United States for a series of lectures and meetings, Einstein received word that his Berlin home had been raided. His apartment, long a quiet refuge, was now a site of interest to those in power. His summer cottage in Kaputh was searched and soon after seized. Colleagues warned him not to return. With measured calm, Einstein made the decision not to go back. He resigned from all his positions in Germany, including his post at the Prussian Academy, and declared his intention to remain abroad. The moment was solemn, and it was not made lightly. For all his misgivings about the state of German politics, Germany had been his intellectual home, the soil in which his ideas had taken root. But now, that chapter had quietly closed. Offers of refuge came from several quarters. Einstein chose, after careful consideration, to accept an invitation from the newly established Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. The institute was not yet the world-renowned center it would later become, but it offered precisely what Einstein valued most: freedom from teaching duties, freedom from political pressure, and time to think, to write, to explore his ideas without distraction. In October of 1933, he boarded a ship for America. The crossing was quiet, the days spent reading or walking the decks. He kept mostly to himself, appearing occasionally for meals, where he was politely approached by other passengers. By the time he arrived in New York, the American press had already stirred itself into a state of reverent excitement. Reporters lined the docks. Headlines proclaimed the arrival of the century's greatest mind. Einstein, as ever, took it all with a calm that bordered on indifference. He answered a few questions, smiled for photographs, and made his way ashore. Princeton was a small town, its pace gentle, its streets lined with leafy trees and modest homes. Einstein settled there with Elsa and his secretary, Helen Dukas, taking up residence in a white house on Mercer Street. The house itself was unremarkable, shaded by tall trees, with a tidy garden and a porch just wide enough for a small bench. Einstein liked it immediately. His days took on a slow, familiar rhythm. Mornings were spent in his study at the Institute, a room filled with papers, a chalkboard, and the occasional shaft of sunlight. He arrived on foot, walking the short distance from home with a thoughtful expression, nodding to neighbours and colleagues as he passed. He wore the same clothes most days, simple wool trousers, an old pullover, and often no socks. Comfort mattered more to him than convention. At the Institute, he worked in near silence. There were no classes to teach, no administrative tasks to attend. He met occasionally with other scholars, mathematicians, philosophers, physicists, but most of his time was spent alone, reflecting on his efforts to develop a unified field theory, a long-standing goal that continued to elude him. The theory, meant to reconcile gravity with electromagnetism, absorbed him for the remainder of his life, yet it brought few concrete results. Still, he persisted. His notebooks filled with equations, his margins with tentative thoughts. He welcomed visitors, both famous and unknown, with a polite warmth. Some came to speak of science, others simply wished to meet him, to shake his hand, to ask for advice. He rarely refused them. He responded to letters from school children with as much care as those from scholars, always writing in the same small, precise hand. Elsa's health began to decline not long after their move to Princeton. She had long managed his public life with quiet determination, shielding him from excess and worry. But by 1936, her strength had faded, and she died at home after a long illness. Her passing left a stillness in Einstein's life that he did not speak of often, though its presence was felt in his long walks, his extended silences, and the way he now spent more time alone at home. Helen Dukas remained, managing his correspondence and household affairs with quiet efficiency. Together with Einstein's stepdaughter Margot, she formed a small circle of care around him. The house on Mercer Street grew quieter still. He continued to play the violin, though less frequently. He walked each day, sometimes accompanied by a colleague, more often alone. The world beyond Princeton grew noisier. War loomed once again. The shadows of fascism spread across Europe. Friends and relatives wrote in desperation, seeking help to flee. Einstein used what influence he had to assist them, writing letters of support, helping to secure visas. He donated to refugee causes, spoke out against oppression, and urged American institutions to open their doors. The work was draining, but he felt it a moral necessity. And still, each morning, he returned to his study. The blackboard waited, the equations unfinished. His thoughts moved slowly now, not from age, but from the increasing complexity of the questions he was asking. Nature, it seemed, was reluctant to yield her final secrets. In Princeton, he found a kind of stillness that he had long sought. No longer pursued by politics, no longer expected to perform, he could sit quietly with his thoughts, unbothered. The garden grew slowly outside. Letters arrived and were answered. Books were read and reread, and in the soft cadence of a life that asked little, Einstein continued to reflect, not only on the nature of the universe, but on the quiet miracle of thought itself. As the 1930s waned and the world moved inexorably toward war, Albert Einstein found himself caught in a quiet tension between his ideals and the realities unfolding beyond his tranquil Princeton study. He had long considered himself a pacifist, one who opposed violence, who distrusted nationalism, who believed in dialogue, reason, and the slow work of peace. But the rise of fascism in Europe, and particularly the dark ascendancy of the Nazi regime, began to trouble these convictions, casting them in shades of urgency he had not previously known. From his home on Mercer Street, Einstein followed the news from Germany with grave attention. Letters from friends and former colleagues carried stories of persecution, of exile, of lives unraveling. The institutions he had once known, academic, cultural, civic, were now weapons in the hands of a brutal regime. Jewish scientists were dismissed, books were burned, and the quiet dignity of inquiry was replaced by ideology and fear. Though physically distant, Einstein was not immune to these developments. He used his voice and reputation to speak out, contributing to refugee relief efforts and appealing to American universities to accept displaced scholars. His own Princeton home became a stopping place for many émigrés, scientists, artists, writers, who came to him seeking letters of recommendation, advice, or simply a moment of reassurance. He listened carefully, responded gently, and did what he could. It was in this charged atmosphere, in the summer of 1939, that a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard approached Einstein with a letter. The letter was to be addressed not to another scientist, but to the President of the United States. In it, Einstein would warn of the possibility that Germany was developing a new kind of weapon, a bomb, powered not by chemistry, but by the immense energy locked within atoms. The implications were grave. If such a weapon were possible, and if Germany were the first to build it, the consequences for the world could be catastrophic. Einstein, though long removed from the core of nuclear research, understood the science. He had not worked directly on uranium fission, discovered only recently, but he grasped the principle. More importantly, he trusted Szilard's judgment and shared his concern, and so, with quiet reluctance, he agreed to sign the letter. The document, dated August 2nd, 1939, was succinct. It alerted President Roosevelt to the potential of atomic energy as a weapon and urged the United States government to engage in research. Einstein did not draft the technical content himself, but his signature carried weight. It was enough to initiate what would become the Manhattan Project. Einstein did not participate in the project's development. He was not invited, and he did not press the issue. His expertise by that time was more theoretical than experimental, and his political leanings made him a figure of some suspicion in certain government circles. Still, he followed the progress with quiet interest, reading what little was made public, and reflecting on the strange and sobering path that had led from his 1905 equation, E equals mc squared, to this new reality. When the atomic bomb was tested in July 1945, Einstein was not informed in advance. He learned of it from the newspapers, like much of the world. The photographs, the headlines, the accounts of the blast, all arrived with a terrible finality. And when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he responded not with anger, but with sorrow. "Woe is me," he said quietly, in Yiddish. He had feared such a moment. Now it had come. He did not attempt to deny his role in the letter to Roosevelt, nor did he claim responsibility for the bomb itself. His position was complex. He believed that the warning had been necessary, that the threat of a Nazi bomb had been real. But he also believed that once the immediate danger had passed, the weapon should never have been used. In the months that followed, he spoke out more forcefully, advocating for international control of nuclear energy and for a system of global governance that might prevent future catastrophes. Einstein's pacifism, though shaken, remained. It became quieter, more reflective, shaped now not by idealism alone, but by grief. He understood that peace could not be a mere aspiration. It had to be structured, maintained, built upon understanding and shared responsibility. He joined organizations dedicated to nuclear disarmament. He signed petitions, wrote essays, gave interviews. His voice, once reserved for the intricacies of light and gravity, now addressed the heavier matter of global survival. And still, through it all, he maintained his daily rhythms. He continued to walk the leafy paths of Princeton, to meet with students and colleagues, to write in his study. He received many letters, some grateful, others accusatory, and answered them with characteristic care. He did not shy away from complexity. He admitted his misgivings, his uncertainties. "Had I known," he wrote to a friend, "that the Germans would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, I would not have lifted a finger." The Mercer Street house remained modest. The garden grew wild in places. The bookshelves were filled not only with scientific texts, but with works on ethics, politics, and poetry. He played his violin less often now, though sometimes in the early evening the faint strains of Mozart could still be heard from the parlour. He did not claim wisdom, nor did he seek forgiveness. He remained, as ever, a quiet figure in a noisy world, a man of thought, trying to live within the consequences of a world transformed by thought. The bomb had changed everything. And yet, in his small Princeton study, beneath a gentle lamp, Einstein continued to do what he had always done. To think carefully, to write thoughtfully, and to hope, perhaps quietly, that reason might still have a place in human affairs. In the calm that followed the Second World War, Albert Einstein's life in Princeton resumed its quiet rhythm, even as the world around him entered a new and uncertain age. The bomb had brought peace, but it was a peace lined with unease, a kind of stilled breath in which the future seemed perpetually suspended. For Einstein, now in his late 60s, the urgency of youth had softened into something gentler, a steady engagement with life, conducted mostly in silence and stillness, save for the occasional visitor, letter, or reflective conversation. His days began early. The mornings were crisp in New Jersey, particularly in autumn, and he would often rise before sunrise, dress slowly, and step out for a walk. He wore the same clothes nearly every day, plain trousers, a slightly oversized jumper, often bearing small signs of wear. His shoes were practical and well scuffed, and in winter he would tuck a scarf about his neck with no particular attention to style. Socks remained a rarity. He disliked them, finding them fussy, and saw no need to change habits that had suited him for so long. He walked slowly, with a gait that was neither brisk nor aimless, measured, as though his thoughts moved just ahead of his feet. Neighbours came to recognize him in this way, often spotting the familiar silhouette making its way past ivy-covered fences and low stone walls. Sometimes he walked alone, sometimes with a colleague or guest. The conversations, when they came, were unhurried and wide-ranging. Politics, music, philosophy, the weather. Rarely, if ever, did he discuss physics in casual conversation. Back at his house on Mercer Street, breakfast would be waiting. Helen Ducasse, his longtime secretary and companion, kept the household running with quiet devotion. She knew the contents of his drawers, the rhythms of his days, and the patterns of his moods. It was she who screened his correspondence, managing the tide of requests and inquiries that continued to arrive from across the globe. Despite his age and reluctance to engage with fame, Einstein remained a figure of deep fascination. His study remained much as it had always been. Papers and books filled the shelves, many of them with pages marked by pencil and time. The desk, worn smooth in places, bore inkpots, spectacles, and a scattering of handwritten notes. He worked without haste, sometimes for hours, sometimes only for moments at a time. His pursuit of a unified field theory continued, not with the driven optimism of his earlier years, but with the patient persistence of someone who understands that some questions may not yield answers in a lifetime. Visitors still came, journalists, scientists, curious admirers. Some hoped for insight, others simply wished to meet the man behind the myth. Einstein received them with a kind of tired gentleness. He was never rude, never dismissive, but often somewhat detached. He listened more than he spoke, responding with a smile, a quiet joke, or a short reflection. He had no interest in defending his reputation. "It's not that I'm so smart," he once remarked with a faint shrug. "It's just that I stay with problems longer." His relationships, by this time, were few but steady. He maintained warm correspondence with friends across the globe. Former students, fellow scientists, artists, even politicians. His letters, always neatly written, carried a tone of quiet introspection. He could be witty, even mischievous, yet he rarely strayed into idle commentary. His words carried weight, and he knew it, yet he did not use them for effect. Though his fame brought many honours, he turned most of them down. He disliked ceremonies, declined medals, and made no effort to collect accolades. When offered the presidency of Israel in 1952, a symbolic position he was wholly unsuited for, he responded with polite astonishment. "I am deeply moved," he wrote, "but at the same time saddened and ashamed that I cannot accept it." He remained deeply concerned with the state of the world. Nuclear weapons, Cold War tensions, the dangers of nationalism all weighed heavily on his mind. He supported international disarmament, encouraged dialogue between nations, and urged scientists to take ethical responsibility for their work. He co-authored the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955, just months before his death, warning of the catastrophic potential of nuclear conflict. "Remember your humanity," it read, "and forget the rest." Despite these concerns, he found solace in small things. The shifting patterns of light through his study window, the smell of paper and ink, the sound of rain on the roof. He continued to play the violin, if more softly now. He played not for others, but for himself, a quiet duet between thought and feeling. His health, always delicate, began to decline in the early 1950s. He experienced abdominal pain, bouts of fatigue, and other signs that the body was slowly withdrawing its support. Yet he refused aggressive treatment, choosing instead to live his days as fully and quietly as he could. He did not fear death. He saw it as a return, a natural transition. "I want to go when I want to go," he said. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially." Evenings were calm. He would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes doing nothing at all. He watched the world through the window as shadows lengthened and birds returned to their nests. Princeton grew quieter after dusk, and he appreciated the hush that settled over the town. In these moments, he seemed closest to the boy he had once been, the child who had gazed at a compass and felt, without fully knowing, that the universe was full of hidden order. In the quiet of these days filled with long walks, well-worn jumpers, soft-spoken visitors, and the persistent murmur of thought, Albert Einstein grew older, not in resistance, but in gentle acceptance. He had lived a life not of brilliance alone, but of quiet consistency, of staying with questions longer than most would dare. And though he remained known to the world as a genius, it was perhaps his humanity, his enduring stillness in the face of complexity, that left the deepest mark. As Albert Einstein entered the final decade of his life, the world around him grew noisier, more accelerated, as if history itself had taken to moving at a pace he no longer recognized. Yet within his quiet Princeton home, the tempo of thought and reflection remained slow, deliberate, almost monastic in its consistency. Time, which he had once studied so intently through the language of equations, now became a gentler companion, something not to be measured but felt. He had long reflected on questions that many would call spiritual, though he approached them not with piety, but with deep philosophical curiosity. His thoughts on God were frequently sought, often quoted, and just as often misunderstood. He did not believe in a personal deity, no cosmic ruler watching human affairs, no divine arbiter of morality. "I do not believe in a God who rewards and punishes," he once wrote, "but in the God of Spinoza, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists." To Einstein, the universe was sacred not in its sentiment, but in its structure. He felt awe before the laws of nature, the regularities that underpinned the visible world. In this way, he believed in a form of cosmic religiosity, not religious in ritual, but in reverence. When asked by a rabbi if he believed in God, he paused and replied, "I believe in Spinoza's God." That quiet sentence rippled outwards, interpreted in 100 different ways. But for Einstein, it meant something very precise, a belief in the unity and intelligibility of the cosmos. Time, too, held a peculiar status in his thinking. Having helped to dislodge time from its absolute pedestal through his theories of relativity, Einstein had come to view it less as a ticking mechanism and more as a coordinate, a way of describing relationships, not an entity unto itself. "The distinction between past, present, and future," he once remarked, "is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." He did not say this coldly, but gently, with a sense of quiet wonder. Time was real in its way, but not fixed. It was woven into the very fabric of space and affected by gravity, motion, and perspective. This view gave him a curious sense of detachment from events. Though he remained engaged with the world, there was always a part of him that observed from a remove, as if standing just outside the circle of activity. He did not dwell on the past, nor fret about the future. He concerned himself with the clarity of thought, the honesty of questions, the elegance of solutions. This did not make him unfeeling, it made him deliberate, composed, even when faced with the intractable. In his conversations and letters, he often returned to themes of simplicity. Everything should be made as simple as possible, he famously said, but not simpler. It was more than a motto. It was an approach to life, a principle that shaped his work, his speech, his manner of living. He believed in clarity over cleverness, in brevity over verbosity. He disliked ornament and avoided excess. His study, his clothes, his meals, all were unadorned, chosen for function rather than display. He distrusted jargon, even in scientific writing. He encouraged students to speak plainly, to strip their thoughts of unnecessary complexity. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, he once said, you don't understand it yourself. His own writings bore the mark of this principle. Carefully crafted sentences, precise definitions, arguments that unfolded not in flourish, but in quiet logic. In his final years, he also reflected more openly on the ethical responsibilities of science. He had seen how ideas, once abstract and peaceful, could be transformed into tools of destruction. He did not regret the pursuit of knowledge, but he urged his fellow scientists to remain aware of its consequences. He wrote essays, delivered gentle lectures, signed petitions. He spoke not as a leader, but as a witness, a man who had watched the power of thought made real, sometimes to tragic effect. Yet he never lost his faith in the human mind. He believed deeply that reason and empathy could prevail, that simplicity, properly understood, could serve not only science, but society. Out of clutter, he wrote in a letter, find simplicity. From discord, find harmony. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. His interactions with children often revealed this simplicity in action. He replied to their letters with care, delighting in their questions. Do scientists pray? One child asked. He answered that scientists do not pray to be answered, but they do feel a deep awe and reverence for the laws of the universe. He saw in such questions not naivety, but sincerity, something he valued above all. Music remained a quiet companion. He continued to play the violin, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. He preferred Mozart, whose compositions he saw as the musical equivalent of his own scientific ideals, clear, balanced, elegant. He did not strive for technical brilliance. He played simply for the joy of it, and because it allowed his thoughts to drift more freely. He aged slowly, without bitterness. His hair turned from white to silver, but his eyes retained their gentle intensity. He welcomed old friends with warmth, sat patiently for photographs, and accepted the ebb of life with equanimity. I am content, he wrote in one of his final letters. I have lived my life, done my work, and now I can go. He never sought to define the world. He merely wished to understand a small part of it, to walk its perimeter, listen to its quiet patterns, and speak now and then when there was something honest to say. In the simplicity of his home, in the clarity of his writing, in the serenity of his presence, there lingered a sense that the greatest discoveries were not the loudest, but the most enduring. And so Einstein's thoughts on God, time, and simplicity formed not a doctrine, but a life shaped by careful inquiry, sustained by wonder, and expressed always in the quietest of terms. The final years of Albert Einstein's life were shaped by an ever-deepening stillness, not one of resignation, but of slow reflection. He had spent decades surrounded by the instruments of thought, Books, notebooks, correspondence, the faint scent of old paper, and the scratch of a fountain pen against thin, unlined sheets. These quiet objects now made up the bulk of his world. From within the walls of his modest Princeton home, he continued to write, not for publication alone, but for the satisfaction of tracing out a question carefully, line by line. The house on Mercer Street grew quieter as the years passed. Elsa had been gone for some time, and the company of old friends dwindled gently. Still, Einstein never lacked for conversation, should he wish it. Visitors came, scientists, diplomats, students, the curious and the admiring. He received them with polite ease, but seldom sought them out. He spoke when needed, listened when he could, and returned when the door had closed to the page. Paper became, more than ever, the terrain on which his thoughts unfolded. His handwriting, slightly tremulous in later years, retained its clarity. His equations, formed in neat rows, bore witness to a lifelong habit of order, even amid uncertainty. Stacks of correspondence accumulated in drawers and folders. Some answered, some left for later. He dictated when necessary, though he preferred to write in his own hand. It gave his thinking a rhythm, a deliberate pace, almost musical in its cadence. Many of his later notes were devoted to the elusive, unified field theory. Though he made small advances, he found no final form to satisfy his deep desire for symmetry and coherence. He understood the limitation, but he did not mourn it. Some truths, he believed, were not hidden. They were simply not yet found. The search is more important than the solution, he once remarked, and the question is often the real answer. Beyond science, his writing became more personal. He reflected on peace, on aging, on the moral obligations of the thinking person. He wrote short notes to children, letters to bereaved families, words of encouragement to scholars whose work he admired. His tone, always measured, grew softer still. Rarely did he express regret. He looked not backwards, but downwards, into the layers of thought, the depth of questions, the texture of silence. He read poetry in those final years, often German verse, sometimes translated classics. He kept a few volumes near his armchair, their pages marked with slips of paper and the occasional penciled line. He also returned to Spinoza, whose vision of a rational, harmonious universe continued to offer a quiet kind of companionship. These readings were not distractions, but extensions of the same pursuit. To know the world not by naming it, but by dwelling within its patterns. Music remained, as ever, his silent ally. He no longer played the violin with frequency, but he listened. The crackle of old recordings filled the room, Mozart and Bach mostly. Sometimes he hummed along under his breath, the melody just audible over the ticking of a nearby clock. He did not mind the aging of his hands, the slowness of his movements. He accepted it as part of the same order he had always respected. Though he seldom ventured far from Princeton, his mind continued to travel. He read widely, philosophy, history, new scientific developments. He kept up with the progress of quantum mechanics, though he remained skeptical of its probabilistic foundations. He knew that the world no longer revolved around the questions he had asked, but he asked them still, out of habit, out of care. Outside, the seasons turned with familiar softness. Spring arrived with pale blossoms. Summer lingered, heavy with humidity. Autumn brought its golden hush. Winter fell quiet, each snowfall muffling the sound of passing cars. Einstein's walks became shorter, his steps slower, but he still moved with purpose, coat buttoned unevenly, hair tousled, eyes alert beneath heavy lids. He would pause to watch a bird or examine a tree, as if recognizing in nature the same laws he had once committed to paper. He was no longer teaching, no longer attending conferences, yet his presence remained central to the institute and to the broader community of thought. His opinions were still sought. His name still carried the weight of clarity. He did not seek to influence, but he remained a witness, a reminder of a time when physics had found itself rewritten not in laboratories, but in a quiet room, by a man with a pen. In many ways, his life had returned to what it had always been, a life of paper, of silence, of inward movement. He was no recluse. He enjoyed company when it came, appreciated a well-told joke, a piece of thoughtful conversation. But his deepest work was always done alone, and now, in these final chapters, that solitude became not a burden, but a gift. As his health declined, he made no preparations for show. There was no autobiography, no grand farewell. He gave instructions that his remains should not be marked, that his body should return to the elements without fanfare. He did not want statues or shrines. "I want to be cremated," he said simply, "and my ashes scattered secretly." He had no interest in being remembered through monuments. His work, he believed, was enough. And so the days passed, each marked not by milestones, but by habits, a walk, a letter, a thought, slowly written out on paper. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, cup of tea cooling in his hand, watching the light fade. There was nothing left to prove, only the quiet unfolding of a life devoted to wonder. Albert Einstein's final years unfolded with the same patient rhythm that had come to define so much of his life. There was no sudden decline, no sharp turning of events. Rather, the end came gently, like the last light of evening settling on a well-worn desk, or the quiet closing of a book one has read many times before. He remained in Princeton, at the house on Mercer Street, cared for by Helen Dukas and Margot Einstein, who managed the small routines of each day with understated devotion. His health, though increasingly fragile, allowed for movement, for short walks when the weather permitted, and for long afternoons spent reading or writing in his study. The garden, slightly overgrown, continued to flower in its modest way, roses and ivy clinging gently to the porch, squirrels and birds going about their untroubled lives. Einstein knew his time was nearing its end. He did not dwell on it, nor did he try to outrun it. There was no fear, no resistance, only a kind of sober attentiveness. He read as much as he ever had, taking in new ideas, revisiting old ones, and maintaining his quiet correspondence with thinkers from every corner of the world. Some days brought letters from heads of state or prominent scientists. Others came from school children, curious and unfiltered. All received the same care in reply, if not always the same length. He continued to work on his unified field theory, though by now he suspected it might never find its final form. He accepted this with equanimity. Not every path leads to a destination, he often mused, but every journey shapes the traveller. He was content to have asked questions that others had not, to have given shape to thoughts that once had no language. Even in frailty, his presence retained its quiet gravity. His hair, now fully white, haloed his thoughtful gaze. His voice had softened, his steps had slowed, but his mind still stirred with the same quiet clarity that had once illuminated the very fabric of space and time. Visitors remarked on the stillness that seemed to follow him, a silence not of absence, but of presence held lightly, like a thought that does not demand to be spoken. He spoke less in those final months. There were fewer conversations, fewer violin pieces played, yet his humour remained intact, dry and well-placed. He found amusement in the absurdities of bureaucracy, the persistence of fame, the curiosity of neighbours. When asked if he believed in an afterlife, he shrugged lightly and said, "I do not believe in immortality of the individual. and I consider ethics to be an exclusively human concern with no superhuman authority behind it. It was not coldness, but clarity, a desire to be honest, even in the face of the unknown. On the morning of April 17th, 1955, Einstein collapsed at home. He was taken to Princeton Hospital, where it was discovered he had suffered an internal aneurysm. The doctors offered surgery, but he declined. "I want to go when I want," he said softly. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially." He requested no extraordinary measures. He wished only for quiet. In the hours that followed, he drifted in and out of consciousness. His final words, spoken in German to a nurse who did not understand, remain unknown. He died in the early hours of April 18th, with no ceremony, no crowd, only the hum of medical instruments and the hush of a room slowly returning to stillness. True to his wishes, his body was cremated later that day. His ashes were scattered in a secret location, known only to a few, and never publicly disclosed. He left behind no grave, no mausoleum, only papers, notebooks, letters, thoughts gently folded into the fabric of human understanding. And that, perhaps, is the quiet legacy of Albert Einstein. Not the icon in textbooks, not the caricature of the wild-haired genius, but the man who thought patiently, who walked slowly, who wrote carefully, and who held the mysteries of the universe in one hand and the ordinary rhythms of life in the other. His theories reshaped physics, to be sure, but his life, so modest, so gently lived, reminds us that even the greatest questions can be asked without noise, that even the boldest ideas can unfold in silence. He believed in simplicity, in humility, in the dignity of doubt. To this day, his words echo, not only in scientific halls, but in quiet rooms where someone, somewhere, is wondering why a compass needle turns, or why the stars seem so still and yet so full of meaning. Einstein's name remains, but it is his stillness we remember, the stillness of a life well thought, the quiet of a mind at peace, the final equation never written, and the soft pencil line left just where he paused to think one more time.